There's a couple of common problems that affect ZW transformers. The first one's fairly minor, and it involves the terminal posts. When you buy a ZW, the first thing you want to do is check all of these terminal posts to make sure that they're tightly bound to the case and to the power strip behind them. Uh-oh, there's a loose one. See that? See how much movement there is there? Well, let's take the case off, and I think we'll be able to see right away what the problem is. I'm going to rotate this over so that you can see how these are mounted inside. Oh yeah, this one's loose, and you see when you turn the nut, the whole stud turns. Okay, what we need to do is get a flat chisel and a hammer and very carefully remove the little peening that's on the back of these binding posts. They go through the case and they're peened on back behind the power strip, so we'll just go in the top and just there was very little left on that one. And remove the defective binding posts, like that. This is what a new replacement binding post look like. You can obtain these from trained parts dealers. When you remove the nut, notice that when you do, the binding post has a knurled side and a smooth side. You want to be sure to put this knurled side with this rough surface right into the transformer like this. Save yourself a lot of grief and consternation. Get a pair of tweezers or long-nosed pliers and hold the nut like this so that you can get it started on the back without it falling down in behind the case. You ought to be able to turn the post and have the nut start on the threads. Yeah, there it goes. Okay. And before we go any farther, let's put the knurled nut back on the post here, because we're going to grip this with a pair of pliers in a moment to keep it from turning while we tighten the nut, and we don't want to mess up the threads. Okay, now let's get a small ignition wrench in here. Get it on tight with the wrench. And just to make sure, we'll hold on to the knurled nut with a pair of pliers and get it good and tight. There, it's in good and tight. And you can see how it looks like on the inside now. And as you can see, that isn't the first post that's been replaced on this transformer. The one right beside it had been replaced before, so that's actually two posts that have been replaced now. We can replace any row across the common strip on the transformer like we just showed you. However, if you find that your transformer has a broken stud on the bottom, then you need to refer to the Spring 95 issue of the Backshop in O-Gauge Railroading the Video. In that issue, when we replaced the rollers, we showed you how to remove the core and hold the rollers back safely so that you'll have plenty of room also to get to these posts. The next thing we're going to do today is take a look at this selenium rectifier. You see this little bimetallic disc right here? Well, this converts a little bit of AC current to DC, which allows the whistle to blow in the tender. Over a period of years, this rectifier can go bad, and it causes the whistle to either not work at all on the tender or behave erratically. We're going to replace this selenium rectifier with a silicon diode. The diode is a much more rugged device that converts this AC to DC, and it will last the life of the transformer. This is what a diode looks like. The smaller one is a 15 amp diode shown here, and the large one is, about a 40 amp diode. When you put a diode in a ZW transformer, you want to put the larger one in, because the small one doesn't leave you enough margin for error. If you have a short that causes the circuit breaker to trip in a ZW, the circuit breaker takes about 15 amps. You want that breaker to trip before the diode does. If you use the small diode, you could blow the diode before the circuit breaker trips. With the 40 amp diode, you are sure that the circuit breaker will trip before the diode does. You can obtain these diodes from electrical distribution or supply houses. What you're looking for is a 40 amp 400 volt anode to case diode. The national semiconductor number is NTE 5991. But that number will cross-reference to scores of other manufacturers of diodes, so you don't need specifically that national semiconductor model. So be sure when you go for a diode that you specify an anode to case or common anode diode. We're going to go in and take this selenium rectifier out of the transformer. In order to do that, we need to unsolder two wires, one over here and one up here on the bulb stanchion. Okay, let's get to this wire first. We'll unsolder it. This is right up on the bulb stanchion. Okay. Then we'll turn it around we'll get this wire right here on this brass solder lug. There we go. Now, we've got the wires unsoldered. We're going to go into these two mount screws that are at the base of this light bulb stanchion and remove those screws. Now, this is not for the faint of heart, because once you have done this, this whole stanchion will lift up. Now, I don't want you to panic if you see a few parts dangling loose. We'll cover that in a moment. There's the first screw. Then we'll go back and get the one at the back. There. Now we're going to carefully lift this whole assembly up. The whistle button, the rectifier, and the bulb base will all come out like this. Now, do you see this paper insulator in here? We're going to reach in and remove that insulator, carefully remove this insulator and set it aside, being very careful that you don't disturb this second paper insulator that has the two little ears on it out here. Leave it where it is, but set the first rectangular one aside. Now we're ready to remove the selenium rectifier disc. Reach underneath this and hold the pin in place, and then get a pair of long nose pliers and pull this out of here and discard it. And you don't need to be careful with this, because we're going to throw all this away. We don't need these parts. That's the disc, the lock nut, and the pin that holds it in place. When you're done, you should have a plate with a large hole in it like that. Remove the nut from the back of the diode, and with a pair of long nose pliers, position the nut behind the plate and thread the diode into the nut through the hole in the plate, like this. And once you get it finger tight, you need a couple of wrenches. In this case, it's 11/16 and 7/16, and tighten the diode onto the bracket. That's what it should look like. This would also be a good time to clean the contact points on the whistle switch. If you have some tuner cleaner, you can spray the tuner cleaner on there, and that would do a good job. If not, some rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip will work just as well. You find the contact points located right behind the black plastic of the whistle switch. There they are. You can see how much dirt is on those points. Now that should work a lot better. Okay, well, now we're ready to put our light bulb stanchion and bracket back in place, but before we do, we want to go inside here. Let's lift this up and take a look and make sure that this paper insulator is in the proper place. Oh, now see, in our handling, we've dislodged this a little bit, and if it looks like this, you want to put these tabs back down and position it directly over that copper solder lug. Once you've done that, then you need to put the second insulator in place. Remember this piece of paper with the 4 holes in it? Position it so that the 4 holes on the paper are closest to the core of the transformer, and also so that this plastic tip comes through the hole as well as this one right here. There, now that looks good. Should look like that when you've done it correctly. Now we're ready to carefully position this bracket back over the top. And I'm saying carefully because you want to be sure not to dislodge the paper that you just put in place. Now you're going to encounter some interference with the wires because you've bent them around a little bit, but when you position this back in, you should see that same plastic tip come up through. If you see that, that means that the insulator papers are in their proper place and you're ready to put the screws in. Locate a screw down through the hole and start tightening it in place. And then the second screw goes into the other hole back in the back. There, now we're ready to solder the wires back in place. Now first, let's tin the diode just a little bit before we can solder the wire back in place. Okay. And then position the wire back in the hole. Like that. And solder the wire back in place. There, that completes that one. Now we still have one wire in the back that goes onto that solder lug. So let's turn the transformer around and position that wire back in the hole. There we go. And the last thing we need to do is reposition the wires so that we can get the case back on properly. There, that looks pretty good. Let's turn it around, and the last thing we want to do is make sure all the wires are away from the roller arms so that the rollers don't chafe any of the insulation on the wires. That looks good. All right, let's put the top of the case back on. Put the screws in, and then once we get the case buttoned up, let's take it on the layout and see how it performs. Well, that new diode made a tremendous difference in the performance on the whistle on that locomotive.